Welcome everyone to CU Denver's Education Policy Networking Series, jointly hosted by CU Denver's School of Public Affairs and the School of Education and Human Development. This is our first event in the series in 2021, and it's also the first time, I think, at least for me, we've done this virtually. But as we've seen over, and many of us have experienced ourselves over the past year, the issues facing public education don't disappear during a pandemic. And in fact, we've seen just the opposite, even as this crisis has demonstrated the vital role that public schools play in our lives and in the life of the nation. It's also spotlighted incredible existing inequalities, both in our education systems and in American society more broadly, and challenges us to consider whether the systems we have are the systems we need in the future. So thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you for your patience as we try to connect with each other as best we can here. We are very fortunate tonight to have with us Superintendent Rico Munn, Superintendent of Aurora Public Schools, to talk with us about these and many of the other challenges that come with leading a school district in a pandemic. Superintendent Munn has led Aurora Public Schools, Colorado's fifth largest school district, since 2013. Aurora is one of Colorado's most ethnically diverse school districts. Its students come from over 130 countries and speak over 160 different languages. Nearly half of the students speak English as a second language, and over 65% of students qualify for federally subsidized school meals. Although in-person classes have recently resumed, the district's 65 school buildings were closed for much of last year, and many were used for many of the things that we forget schools do on a daily basis, like feed millions of children across the country who otherwise go without. So thank you very much, Superintendent Munn, for joining us, and welcome. Please just, if you could start, let's dive right in. And if you could please just give us an overview of what the last year has been like and where are Aurora's students now?
Well, thank you for having me, first of all, Parker, and thank you for your participants for joining in. You know, it's obviously been an incredibly challenging year in so many ways for all of us, but in public education in our school district, the pace of change has been breakneck, and it's been nothing like anyone had, thought or prepared for. To my recollection, the first confirmed case of COVID in Colorado was on March 5th, 2020. By March 12th, there were so many cases confirmed in the state that we were actively contemplating if we would go on, because we started spring break on that day, and whether we would then extend that or what we would do. We decided to extend our spring break an extra week, thinking that that would be helpful and that would be impactful. And little did we know that that would just be the start of what's been at this point close to a year of having our kids distant from us and engaging in remote learning. That was March 12th. By March 17th, we had stood up, I believe, 16 to 20 locations to deliver meals to families. And as of today, we've delivered over 4 million meals since that time. By March 23rd, we had created an online school, and it became clear that we might not be coming back for a while. And then by April, we were already planning for what the next school year would look like, with the expectation that at least some of that would be remote. So things happened very quickly, and things keep happening and shifting very rapidly.
Again, thank you, Superintendent Munn. So let's dig a little deeper in. So are students in school right now in Aurora, 40,000 of them, or what percentage or portion of them are in school buildings, I should say?
So at present, we have about 40% of our families have opted to stay completely virtual for the entire year. And for the remainder right now, we are doing a hybrid model P12 for K-12, where 50% of kids are in the building on an A week and a B week. We expect that by the end of this weekend, we're going to look at the data, look at our mitigation measures, and make a decision around whether we can ramp that up and what that will look like.
And so how would you describe, I guess the question I have about this is, if you look across the country, there's 16,000 districts across the country, ranging in size from 500 students all the way up to 1 million. And we see lots of different experiences across those thousands of different contexts. How do you see Colorado's experience in comparison to other states, and what has been the role of the state in helping you navigate this?
Well, I think every state and every district has had a pretty individualized experience. I think out of necessity to a certain degree. We have a weekly phone call. We're a member of the Council of Great City Schools, which involves a number of the largest school districts across the country, and we have a weekly phone call to compare notes, compare best practices. So we have a pretty good handle on what's happening in at least the major districts across the country. But the reality is we all have different COVID numbers. We all have different buildings. We all have different age of buildings and size of buildings, and all of those differences have created different responses and different reactions. And I think here in Colorado, in our political context, the state has been able to create a structure that it took some time, but I think now we're at a structure where we all understand what the dial is and what that means, and what numbers to look at, and what to respond to and what not to respond to. And so over time, we've developed that understanding, but obviously that took all of us some time to get to that place.
You noted there part of the challenge that I've been thinking about, that I imagine you must be facing, is this reality that your district covers, I think it's something like 150 some square miles, and it is very different across the many different communities that the district serves. And how have you tried to lead across those differences, and what challenges and what has that been like?
Well, we started with knowing that this had to be first and foremost a public health response, that we knew that was a public health crisis, and we had to become very steeped in that. And I held a conference call with all of our building leaders on March 12th or March 13th. Said, look, we are going to have one true north, and that is the guidance of our local public health agency, Tri-County Health. Tri-County covers both Adams and Arapahoe County, which we are both in. And so we have worked very closely with Tri-County Health, very closely with their expertise to try to understand, again, what numbers do we look at, what do we react to, what pitches do we let go by, but how do we understand that across the span of our district? And then also working with them to develop data and analysis around the area that is specifically APS, and not just Adams or Arapahoe County in general.
So stepping back a little bit from the immediate crisis, I'm a history junkie myself, and so I've been looking at the historical development of school districts in Colorado, and I hope it's reassuring, although I don't imagine that it is, that you're not the first generation of superintendents to face this kind of challenge. I saw that between 1900 and 1925, Colorado school districts added 100,000 students and built 160 some school buildings. Is that kind of mass organization among the public sector still even possible do you feel as though you are confronting that kind of generational challenge?
Well, yeah, I mean, I certainly think this is a generational challenge. When you look at just the disruption to everyone's life and the shifting to, in so many ways, right? What became a lot of our cultures became much more on demand as we all engage more in, everything from streaming platforms to home deliveries to even now remote education. Those are very generational shifts. When you put that on top of the changes that were already being experienced in Aurora as we were looking at shifting demographics in the original Aurora and new developments on the eastern side of our district, when you add that on top of it, it is a very generational shift.
Are there things that I mean, I'm sure there are lots of things, but are there things you can identify that you really wish the public understood about the operations and overall sort of weight of responsibility that a school district like Aurora undertakes?
Well, I think most people don't really appreciate that a large school district is like a small city. When you look at the scope of things that we encompass, just APS, we've got 5,000-6,000 employees, 40,000 kids we're responsible for. We've got probably 70 buildings, which represents hundreds of millions of dollars of real estate assets. Our annual budget is several $100 million. All those things are large, right? We have a bakery, we have a police force. Those are all things that we manage and had to manage throughout this pandemic. When you think about the state's largest districts combined, the top 10 of us, it's billions of dollars and billions of dollars in assets and thousands of employees and then thousands of students who we take very seriously the responsibility to serve and support.
Am I right that it sounds like that one of the things maybe people don't realize is how many people are still working in person every day across the system? Is that true?
I don't know if people understand that or not. I mean, I don't know that people understand how many people worked throughout the entire pandemic. Even as we shut down in-person learning, we still had a lot of people, administrative people in buildings, planning. We had security staff, we had nutrition services, we had custodians. They were still essential workers, all still coming to work every day through all the teeth of the pandemic.
And that makes me think of another part of the history of the development of districts and just the way that they have been built really to withstand change over the long term and are really more built for stability and predictability than this kind of crisis. And have you experienced that? And are there benefits and drawbacks to that structure of the district?
Well, I think there are tremendous benefits to having a large entity that can provide that kind of stability. I think the challenge becomes most people only interact with their local school. And so their connection to the district isn't to the district as a whole, it's really to their local elementary or middle or high school or whatever else. And so they don't necessarily appreciate, and nor do they have to, what's going on behind the scenes. But that sometimes can be frustrating because they expect it to move like a small entity, right? Like a small local school, when the reality is it's part of a much bigger organization, and sometimes the shift is more complicated.
It also seems as though the public itself is not used to the district differentiating the way that it acts either. So I'm thinking of the example that I'd like to spend a few minutes talking through here that came up this fall, where the the district is faced with this choice where it can send some portion of the students back into classrooms in person, arguably safely, but one choice would be to send everybody from a particular grade, or another choice might be to target those interventions towards students who are more vulnerable to being out of school. For example, English language learners or special education students. And one of the things I noticed in your work in the fall was your effort to do exactly that in Aurora, and to try to have the district bring back some of these more vulnerable populations, rather than sort of approaching the whole system as one. Can you talk through what that was like, and why ultimately you think you weren't able to achieve that?
Well, I do think we were able to achieve that, just not for
Sorry, I
long.
didn't mean to load
Yeah.
that question in any way.
No, that's
Yes.
okay. No, I just wish we could have done more and longer.
And to walk people through what happened, if you would, October, November.
So as we came into the school year, our board decided that they wanted us to start the year in remote across the district. However, we did get board authorization to bring in specialized groups in smaller settings in order to provide education. And really that came from the public health guidance. The public health guidance at the time was that that you can do in-person learning if you do it in smaller groups, and if you really have very controlled environments. And so we really tried to identify if we can only do essentially a few kids, if we can only do it in a few environments, what's going to be the highest areas of need. We identified a couple of those. One we identified were our preschool kids, who we knew that remote learning was not going to be an environment that really led to their development. A second was our students with special needs, who many of them simply, the technology was not accessible to them, or the types of support they needed simply was not amenable to remote learning. And so for a couple, and the third group was language learners, who we knew, particularly newcomers, new to the country. And
Which you have a significant population of, right? Mm-hmm.
We've got significant numbers of those. And you can imagine having someone new to the country and saying, here's a Chromebook, welcome to school. We didn't think that was going to really lend itself to their development. And then as we moved further into that process, we also then added kindergartners, because we were seeing by the numbers that there were a significant number of kindergarten families that simply didn't show up, which told us that there was a higher level of need. So we were able to engage those groups for really from August until October. And then there was a significant spike in the COVID numbers to where the board felt it was not appropriate or safe to continue that. And so we went back to fully remote at that point in time. But yeah, as far as communicating to the community about different groups, I do think the fact that we could pretty clearly point to public health guidance, pretty clearly point to why we weren't just open and why we weren't just having every single kid in. Now other districts had different structures, were doing it different ways. And some of those, that became a difficult communication. But we kept trying to point back to, here's our understanding of how best to implement public health guidance.
Are there things about bringing back a specific population from across grades that presented particular challenges?
Well, look, there wasn't anything that we're doing that don't present challenges at this point.
Sure.
I would say that.
I guess what I'm saying is that, just to cut to the chase, is that the board did eventually overrule the decision to bring back those small populations. And maybe you're saying that was more related to what was happening in a public health environment. But another way to see it is that it was more about a resistance to differentiating the services the district was providing in that way, which, I'm trying to understand why it might have not wanted to go the approach that seems to focus most on the most vulnerable students.
Well, I think there are probably a mix of reasons. One was just the base of it was a heightened public health environment that was challenging. Then within that, there was certainly a question by different stakeholders as to why is it safe for one group of students and not for another, and feeling that a level of discomfort with that.
Yep. Are there ways that that the district has reacted that you feel like people have seen new ways of doing things that maybe they might not have thought of before? That I don't like any talk of a silver lining from this, but are there things that align with other changes in our society that may actually help us in the long term to respond to these kinds of events in the future?
Yeah, I fully believe and expect there are. I don't believe we've had the space to truly reflect back on that and say, here's really some of that learning. But some of the obvious things are, March 12th, we were not a one-to-one district. We were not a district that provided a remote learning platform. We weren't a district that provided that kind of instruction or support. That was different 10 days later. And I don't see it going back from that. We have to find structures that make sense for our district and our community along those lines. And that's certainly something we will learn and grow from.
Another area that I want to dive into a little bit that I referenced earlier is that Aurora was facing massive change before this pandemic, and in ways I want to talk about more in a few minutes. Has lots of challenges that you don't normally see in one district, but you often see in more than one district separately at the same time. And so one of the things, though, I do, as an example, is that you have been engaged in a facility assessment process, and both in terms of the district's existing facilities and utilization of those facilities, and then also the potential need for new ones. But the decision to close schools due to under enrollment is considered one of the most difficult, if not the most difficult decisions a superintendent and a school board can make, both for the people who are impacted by the decision, right, and for the larger community. And yet the board in Aurora just voted to close 2 schools last month. And so help us understand how you led the district through that process.
Yeah, and just to be clear, they actually voted to close 4 schools.
Oh, wow. Excuse me.
2 immediately and 2 in 2 years' time. Yeah, and what you're speaking to is a process that we call Blueprint APS. And we started that process and that conversation formally in October of 2017. We came to the board and said, it is very clear that the demographics of Aurora are changing. It's very clear that we are going to see significant development on the eastern side of the district. At the time, there were, I believe, 12 active developments planned. And we have no buildings over there. We clearly needed to address that. And then on the other side of the district, it had been clear to us for the last 2 years that we were seeing a decline in enrollment because of different shifts, such as declining birth rate, some gentrification, and then some changes in housing prices, and all those things were causing a significant shift. And so we came to the board and said, these are our realities, and in about 2 or 3 years, this is going to be a significant budget impact if we don't start addressing this. And we launched a process then, which we knew would be a multi-year process, to have a community dialogue, a community conversation around how do we think about our facility usage, how do we think about our resources in a way that aligns with our community values and meets the interests and desires of our community. And so we tried each step along the way to have incremental conversations and get to incremental steps and go back to the community and get more feedback. And that led up to this latest vote, which happened about a month or so ago, formally to close several schools, to build several other schools, and then to change the program and the usage of another set of schools.
So it seems to me that part of your role as a public leader includes trying to bring decision makers together and the public, a very diverse public in your case, with at all levels of the socioeconomic spectrum and the full sort of American experience. And it seems to me that you have this need to try to show people that what they might be losing immediately in any one part of the city is in fact necessary for the overall health of the system. And that's a hard sell, arguably, in our current environment and record levels of distrust in government, et cetera. In my experience working in a school district, this issue of trade-offs was always ever present. And it seemed like that's very much a part of this closure debate most recently, where for those who are directly impacted and who are experiencing this loss, they have a real interest in preventing it. And yet at the same time, there are consequences to continuing to operate those schools with enrollment that means requires subsidization from others. Yeah, so could you talk us through those kinds of trade-offs?
Yeah, I mean, in any budgeting situation, in any changing situation, there's always trade-offs. And part of what we try to do over our 3-year engagement and dialogue process was to hear from the community, what are your priorities? What are the things that are most important to you collectively? And, you're never going to get a perfect, popular poll around those things, but you can start to develop themes, you can start to develop plans. And that's what we did, is we developed several themes, and then we developed several scenarios. We actually developed, I think, 5 scenarios. And then we took those scenarios back out to the community, and we in as stark language as we could, said, here are the pros and cons. We can execute any one of these, but here are the pros and cons of each of these choices. And you need to understand and those choices and understand what those pros and cons are with each of those choices. And I had a great dialogue with a parent at one of our town halls around this, probably about a year and a half ago, where she came to me. She goes, I'm very frustrated because I don't see the choice where I get everything.
Yeah.
And she was half joking, but it was a recognition that this is life, and there are no options where you get everything. There are only choices to be made. And then that process, and then led and culminated by our board, they made a decision around which way to go, which framework. We then came back again to be clear, here are the pros and cons, here are the choices that will have to be made. And that was understood, and we put that out about a year and a half ago. And then we began the process of making those a reality. And so this last vote was the reality of, and we can point to, and we have repeatedly, here is the process that got us here. Here are the steps. Here are the choices that this community has made along the way, which are difficult choices. But the priority has always been what this community has said it wants at the end of the day. And I think so long as we stay true to that, then we were able to authentically lead a conversation.
So I want to get to the comment from the parent in a minute, but before I do, it does this would be difficult to get neighborhoods, communities to agree to, absent the kind of socioeconomic and racial and cultural diversity that you have in Aurora. And so layered on top of the decision-making process that you just described is also racial and socioeconomic disparities that we might like to think the government can operate without engaging in, but it seems to me that the experience of school districts is proof that inattention to those issues is just as detrimental to progress as yeah. So I guess as doing nothing. So tell me, how do you explain this and put this in the context of a community that has already experienced historic disenfranchisement and is experiencing ongoing economic inequality, declining opportunity?
Well, again, I mean, we lead with what we're going towards, what the community has said that it wants. And we have to be very clear that we are driving towards and developing the outcomes and the results that this community has said that it wants. And we try to make it as clear as we can in a retail sense, right? If you and your family decide that you either need to or want to buy a new car, you have to make choices. You have to choose to, have a cheaper cable package or not go to get coffee everywhere. Whatever those decisions are, you have to make those choices to achieve that outcome that you want. And everyone understands and recognizes that to be a truth and a reality. It doesn't mean they like it. It doesn't mean that they necessarily accept that you've made the right choices, but they understand at least the framework that you're operating from. And we've tried to be as transparent as we can in that process so people can look back and question every step along the way, the authenticity of it.
And is it also right that the board has committed to investments in those communities in the future as well? The example I think I'm referring to is the promise of building a new facility on at least one of the sites of the closed school. Is that part of this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, it's well, again, it's a recognition of the shifting demographics. It's not that we don't need schools in a certain part of town, but we don't need them in the current structures that we have. And so, for example, we have talked about closing Lindell Elementary School and also in a couple of years South Middle School, and then in a couple of years down the road as well, 6th Avenue Elementary School. All those kids still need to go to school somewhere. And so by consolidating them into one brand new building, we are making a better use of our resources long term and also providing the community with something to look forward to and an opportunity.
Sure. And making this not just about loss for some, right? And so that leads me now to this again, maybe a bigger picture question, but the fact that you're dealing with this in a pandemic makes it all the more challenging, I would think, which is that I'm fascinated by the fact that, in some places in America, this idea that you can get everything you want in your public schools is very much alive and well, right? And there are communities in America where people demand it and they get it and they arguably wall off the outside world around them, and that's often associated with even this whole idea of development and new growth and bigger is better and the American dream and even, manifest destiny, right? So Aurora has on one level that dynamic on its eastern frontier, really, where you have large parcels of unoccupied land or land in farm use or prairie, but projected. I mean, I encourage anyone who's interested in this from a systems level to go check out the development maps that Aurora has on its website, because it's really remarkable, the extent to which you are planning out what looks like in other contexts a traditional suburban school district. On your western side of the district, where the core of Aurora's population lives and it is densest, it's also its most racially diverse and its lowest income, you're losing enrollment. And so it's almost like you're experiencing the two parallel lives of American public education in the same single place. So I don't mean to be overly, melodramatic about this, but I wonder if you could talk us through how you imagine being able to have people, who in other contexts, we don't require to actually agree with each other. We build district lines around them.
Yeah. I mean, you make my job sound hard, Parker.
I don't envy your job at all the next 20 years is going to be remarkably difficult at Aurora, challenging.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't expect to see all those 20 years.
No, you can live in hope.
Look, we recognize that in a growing community like Aurora, there's going to be continual diversity. And I think we have to keep talking about it in terms of diversity. And we also talk about the complexity of what we do. I don't talk about it, some people talk about, the challenge or we talk about its complexity. And it's how do we manage complexity? How do we recognize complexity? How do we then manage complexity and plan for complexity? And one example of that is, I want to say 5 years ago, maybe, we recognized the growing possibility of a level of haves and have-nots that was growing in our district. And that still is not in a significant range for us, but it will grow. And so how do we start to think about that? How do we start to address that? And one example of how we started to change that was at the beginning of the school year, we have a back to school event, a backpack giveaway, those kinds of things. And when I came to the district, we held that event on the football field behind Aurora Central, which is in the heart of original Aurora, which is the heart of some of our most complex part of the district. And what we saw was that because it was held on a football field in August, in Aurora Central, we had a couple of dynamics. One, a lot of our families from further south who tend to be in more affluent neighborhoods and further west didn't come because one, it was either too far or it was over there. And secondly, it was 300 degrees August, right? And nobody really wanted to be out there. And so we thought, how do we change this dynamic? And so we worked with the town center, the mall in Aurora, moved the event to the mall. And so it was more central to the district. It was on a TOD, a transit point, so people could get there easily across the whole district. It was centralized. It's air conditioned. It's the mall. And so it became a community event where everybody could come together at the beginning of the school year, meet their principal, meet a couple of their teachers, get free backpacks. We took over the parking lot and we have a fair going on that is just absurd, right? We've got, cheerleaders and, dunk tanks and all kinds of things to say, we are APS and we are back to school together and we're excited. And I think that's just an example of how we have to very intentionally build community and build an identity as the Aurora Public Schools that is resilient to whatever the other complexities are around us.
And thank you for that. And I hope I'm not going to get too personal here, but I want to just share with you that I only just yesterday saw again the op-ed that you wrote from this summer in the midst of the outpouring of emotion and demands for racial justice in America. And you wrote an op-ed about your experience as an African-American man in America, as a superintendent, as a father. And I wonder if you could just reflect on that a little bit with us in this context of, I mean, in the hyper politicized debate that we have around education, right? It's sometimes mind-blowingly detached from the everyday lives of people, going about their business, trying to do the best for their family. And one of those examples to me is, this idea that that education is not actually the pathway to freedom, and is somehow, we don't need to worry about that as much, and we need to worry about this other stuff. And yet we also see that education, in fact, is the pathway to liberation for millions of people, even though it is not what it ever was promised to be, and continues to fail so many people. But you are in the position of explaining to your son that this is, in fact, the greatest, institution, one of the greatest institutions in America. So what is that? Tell us what that's like.
Well, look, there have been so many things in the last year that are so overwhelming. Everything from the election and insurrection to the death and the killing of George Floyd, to all, and then obviously in the background of a pandemic, it can be very overwhelming for people. And one of the things that's often, just to be frank, strange to me, but it's also flattering, is whenever there are these moments, there seems to be some desire for every community leader to say something, right? You have to come out and say something around the time. And when we were in the midst of civil unrest and Black Lives Matter, and there were, interest that I was hearing for me to say something, I was like everybody else experiencing it, and experiencing in very personal ways those feelings. And I didn't really know what to say. And so I thought the best service I could provide was to explain to my community, to the people who worked with and for me, how I saw the world and how I processed these events around me, and therefore how that would impact and influence the decisions I made. So that's what that op-ed was just an attempt to be honest and say, here's my experience and how I see the world, and how that informs my work and my decisions. And I think, as I said in the op-ed, I think the people, when you're in a position to make decisions that have significant impacts on people's lives, to a certain degree, they have the right to know how you see the world, because I think that helps them understand whether that's something they want to be part of or not. And then in my own personal experience, dealing with my son and also my daughter, trying to help them make sense of what they were seeing and understand their place in the world, understand both their opportunity, but also understand some cautionary tales about their life and the life that was in front of them.
One of the questions I have watching the various issues that Black Lives Matter movement has focused on is that it has not, in my view, focused very much on educational inequality in America. And I wonder if you agree, or if you think it doesn't, it's not part of the quest for racial justice to to change the way that school systems operate?
Well, the reason I do this work is I fundamentally believe that education is a human rights imperative. And I don't know to what extent you or your participants have read my bio, but I come, my background is as a lawyer. I've done a lot of human rights work around the world for many years, and so that is the lens I bring to it, is that it's a human rights imperative. I don't know. I think the Black Lives Matter movement, in my perspective, the core of it is about making sure that all of the systems that exist recognize fundamentally the humanity of Black people, and recognize that the systems and the structures have operated in a way that does not recognize that humanity. And so I don't think it necessarily is attached to one particular institutional structure or another, as much as it is an attempt to inform all institutional structures of that historical failing and the imperative for that historical change.
Thank you very much for engaging me with these issues. I am just going to share, that in some ways this is also a personal issue for me, and that I am married to a Latino woman, and my son is brown skinned, and the world will perceive him as brown skinned. And part of what I myself am having to grapple with is how to talk about my belief with him that public education is this incredible human creation, and yet it also has so failed to live up to its promise. And I guess one of the things it seems like there's a lot of I can't help but see, though, just with respect to your response, that it does seem to be some defensiveness from existing systems about the ways in which they might operate that would, for example, reflect racism and classism, and yet we don't even realize it. And so, one example I would identify are teacher placement processes that are blind with respect to student need. I believe that certainly has the potential to operate in ways that simply perpetuate racial and economic hegemony. And yet, it's not something that we're very comfortable addressing, as we've seen just even most recently in Denver, and as I know you all have struggled with in Aurora. So how do you think about pushing your district on these kinds of issues? And maybe that issue is not a good example, but I imagine there are ways in which the system inadvertently or even inadvertently operates to create disadvantage and perpetuate it.
No, I think that's a great example. A year ago, pre-pandemic, actually, believe it or not, that time existed. And about February of 2020, we were starting our negotiation process with our union about the upcoming master agreement. And in conversations with my team and with our board, we decided that we needed to fundamentally change the dynamic of that conversation if we were to be true to our beliefs around equity. And so we launched that process with a memo to our union counterparts and said, we want you to understand and be clear that we will be walking into this negotiation and our work forward with equity at the forefront, and with equity as the lens through which we will look at all of this contract, and that we will evaluate the agreements that we make, everything from compensation to teacher assignment to planning time. We will utilize an equity lens to apply to everything that we do. And I think that was, I don't want to say a radical statement, but it was definitely a shift.
Controversial. Mhm.
And I think it was definitely going to impact in significant ways how we approach the work. Um, Pandemic hit, and so we did not really get to fully live out that intention and that work around how we wanted to embrace that. And I don't think we will either this year because of how we will think about the structures, but I don't think we have left that belief structure, that belief system, but how we now apply that to our systems when we're already shifting so much it's a much more a la carte kind of view to it as opposed to a large structural view.
Thank you very much. And I want to make sure we do get a couple questions here. We have a question about sort of lasting lessons from this, and I wonder, just to build on that question and related to what you've just said, do you have any hope that perhaps the pandemic has shifted the way people might think about some of these issues and in terms of their prioritization and some of the politics around these issues? Is there any hope to be had from this?
Well, look, you can't work in K-12 without hope. I mean, that's the nature of the beast.
Yeah, amen. Yeah.
And so, yes, I certainly have hope about that. Now, I think, in the next couple of months, we will see what's the push. I think is the push from, and the ethereal world is to try to get back to where we were, or is the push to try and define something new? And where's the weight of that, and how does that play out? And I don't know the answer to that. For us and for me, as we think about and plan for next year, there's absolutely no part of my planning that assumes we are going back. I don't view that
as was exactly, you mean?
Right. Yeah. I don't view that as a reality. And so we're not even planning for that frame of mind. And now we have to try and bring the system along with us and try and bring people's psyche to a degree along with us to whatever that new place is.
Yeah, you hit on what we have just a few more minutes here, but you hit on an issue which I think is very much live in our national political education debate around the nomination of a new Secretary of Education and the changeover in administration from arguably what was a blow everything up and watch what happens afterwards of the former administration to what sounds like sort of references to farther together. And I hear some of that messaging in your language as well. And I wonder if you could think about, you've been a superintendent since in Aurora, in same place since 2013, and yet you have moved the district forward, and maybe not always as fast or as quickly as you might like, but there's some argument to be made for a degree of humility in this work around the ability to make change fast in these systems. Is that a challenge you confront?
Well, look, I mean, you never are moving as fast as you like when you realize that every year is another group of kids, right? And another set of opportunities. And so you want everything to move at the same speed that the kids are growing up, but you also recognize that's not a reality. And so you have to set your goals and identify your goals in a way that is big, that's audacious, and that is ambitious, but also in such a way that you're not being untruthful to the community that you serve about what you can get done and how you can get that done, so that they also can understand and make choices in their own lives. And I'm excited for a new administration that can hopefully be a partner in that. We spent 4 years living in fear that the Department of Education would call, and we're past that period of time as we now think about what are opportunities with a different administration.
So last question here is from an attendee, and I think is something that we have not gotten into as much as we might have, but we could have a whole nother session on this, which is the way in which the pandemic has revealed the interconnected nature of our systems, and things like preschool and trying to fit that into the K-12 paradigm, and then also post-secondary learning opportunities. There was a lot of discussion today on Capitol Hill about career and technical education. Yet we also know that's not a panacea or a silver bullet, and can't, so how do you think about the possibility of integrating the district more with the various other ways that education and our society interact?
Well, look, we recognize that we are with kids in a part of their lives for a significant window, but not the only part of their lives. And we want to make sure that we have partners who can help support them coming into our system, and then partners that we can support as they move on to whatever the next stage of the success of their life. We've got great partnerships like with the Community College of Aurora, who are great friends of ours and we work very closely with. And we want to make sure that our structures can support them moving into success at CCA or success at Stanford, right? And making sure that we think about and recognize the strengths of what our students get from our system, that they can be then successful in theirs, right? And we can't just think about what it means to be a success in the APS system. We have to think about what it means to set students up to be successful in all kinds of other structures. And that resilience, I think, is an incredible part of what we try to build with our students.
Sounds a lot like education for liberation. So thank you very much for spending the time with us tonight, Superintendent Munn, and for your openness and willingness to share. And thank you most of all for your leadership for Aurora's students and families, and for Colorado. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in the future.